benefit, the huge skill sets, fantastic construction skills people, fantastic hospitality skills people, great chefs. At any one time in the UK, we have 4,500 cooks, chefs, making food inside prisons for prisoners. These people rarely get jobs in the hospitality sector, so we've got this complete breakdown in what would normally be a perfectly integrated economic reality. The companies, therefore, that are our first wave of companies who put their vacancies and jobs on the jobs board, both have a predilection towards actually working with ex-offenders. So some fantastic big companies like the Waite Construction Company, like Timpson's, the cobblers, I suppose. There's a big company called Mighty that does facilities management. They employ more than 6,000 chefs across the country, so they're working with us to advertise jobs. People like Premier Inn, really good at opening doors, taking people on through Woodward, Emma, so people at Cost, people at Premier Inn, etc. Many of them, could come from a background where they've got a criminal record, but it doesn't make a difference in terms of the work that they're actually doing. Brexit, regardless of what we think about it, Brexit is going to exacerbate this kind of situation. And it's not the palace here for everything. And there are some people who've done some horrendous things inside jail, and we're not talking about them. We're talking about really, I put it kind of finger in the air, around about 25% of people who come out of prison or people who go straight into the jail, pretty much straight into the jail. Where I think the number is down about the 5% level. So we're missing about 80% of a really sweet spot market that could actually do some fantastic work.
Do you think before your experience of prison, you would have had the same kind of prejudice against employing ex-offenders?
I think I just wouldn't have even known about it at all.
Like many parts of the public sector, the prison service has faced budget cuts over the years, and presumably has impacted training within prisons and the kind of advancement that prisoners might be able to get whilst they're inside. Has that been a problem for you?
Yes, it has. A real problem, and it comes across in a number of different ways. And it's a fairly recent problem as well. If you haven't got enough staff and you're dealing with maybe a healthcare issue or some particular security issue, actually then taking somebody from the cell over to the workshops is a real impediment, even though we can then actually get people straight into work.
Some people would say, why has this been left to you? This is a function of government to help people get work after they leave prison or if they have a criminal conviction.
The journey from not having a job and having a criminal record to having a secure, sound, sustainable job is quite a long journey. The skill sets that are applied in the whole system, I found, are very much more focused on the, if you like, front-end areas of somebody's journey, the early stages in their development, making sure that they are, in some way, employable, that they understand what a CV is, that they understand about having a
Further information and terms of use, go to bbc.co.uk/5live.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Unfortunately, due to rights restrictions, we're not able to bring you the current sports commentary on this platform. You may be able to listen on an alternative platform. For further information and terms of use, go to bbc.co.uk/5live.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Unfortunately, due to rights restrictions.
Temer to go. A deeply unpopular president tainted with corruption scandals. And come October, there'll be a new leader. But who will it be? Former President Lula da Silva is currently the frontrunner. Despite the fact that he too is involved in corruption scandals, he still has millions of fans among poorer Brazilians. But current second place is far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro. Nicknamed Brazil's Trump, he's the face of conservatism and supports military rule. Dirty politics and an economic crisis have left people disheartened. Cristiano Pinheiro, who has 2 young children, voted for Lula previously because he offered a change from old politics.
Lula came from a less privileged background, from the working class. So I thought he would be the best person who could represent them.
But she was left disappointed.
Brazil has been exploited both by the left and the right. There's no sense of dignity, of common gain. So if you ask me who are you going to vote for, I don't know.
So where's it all gone wrong? Mauricio Franzaglia is a professor of political science at Mackenzie University in Sao Paulo.
When the economy goes well, the other problems seem smaller. With the economical crisis, the other problems seem bigger. In this kind of situation, people are more likely to support radical ideas. In a broader way, you can say that people are disappointed with democracy. I think people will find new ways to participate in politics by social networks, social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc.
Tenemos en nuestras manos la posibilidad de acabar con la corrupción.
And you can see that in Mexico, electing its new president in July. Andrés Manuel López Obrador is the leading candidate. A populist, he's vowed to tackle corruption in a country that's notorious for its dirty politics. He famously opposed President Trump, but his critics accuse him of being a firebrand.
Ante el país y ante el mundo, un nuevo acuerdo de paz con las FARC.
And then there's Colombia, which is experiencing a new political dawn. Back in 2016, the government and rebel group FARC signed a peace deal ending more than 5 decades of conflict. In March, there are parliamentary elections, and it'll be the first time that FARC will stand as a political party. Its leader says he'll run for president in May's presidential elections. So is there a pattern emerging? A move from the left to the right, perhaps? It's not so simple, says Oliver Stenkel of the Getulio Vargas Foundation.
If you have a right-wing candidate or a left-wing candidate, then you can sort of prepare for those 2 scenarios. But in the current situation, and due to the extreme amount of candidates in places like Colombia and Brazil, you may have 20 to 30 presidential candidates, and that allows a candidate to go into the second round with perhaps 15%. So that it makes it a bit of a lottery. In that sense, I think it's very difficult to identify a clear narrative of a shift to the right. Basically, the entire political situation in most countries is in flux.
And that leaves Venezuela, where I am now, the wild card in the region. Presidential elections were expected to be held late in the year, but it's thought they may bring them forward. President Nicolas Maduro has an approval rating of about 30%, but the opposition is in tatters after the protests. For now, Mr. Maduro is in a position of strength, and the thought is he'll use that to his advantage and try and stay in power. There are lots of unknowns in the region. 2018 is set to be full of surprises.
A little like 2017 then. Katie Watson. PM is at 5, I'm Chris Mason. That's The World at 1:45.
Studio directions by Nicolas Braufaust. The editor was Chris Wimpress. We're at Rambridge in a quarter of an hour where Roy needs to talk. But first, here on Radio 4, we begin a new series, Conflict and Cooperation, a History of Trade. It's presented by the economist and author Paul Seabright, and it explores the long history of how and why we exchange goods and ideas. The series looks at trade across the world and far back in history. Paul begins a story close to home, in France.
Le Vivant, a cafe in Toulouse in southwest France, is an extraordinary building. It's decorated in gilt with scenes of angels and semi-naked sylphs dancing around, a style that reflects the supremely confident Belle Époque of the late 19th century when it was built. So why would I start a series on trade here? Well, in the series we're going to range far and wide. We'll see how wars were fought over the price of nutmeg and cloves, how untold numbers of people were enslaved because of movements in the cotton market, and how mice and rats bear witness to the rise and fall of civilizations. But this cafe, less than half a mile from where I live, has a special place in the story. It played a crucial and little-known part in the outbreak of the First World War. More on that shortly. And a century and a half earlier, not far from here, the city had a famous visitor. Adam Smith, professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, came to Toulouse as part of a grand tour. He didn't visit the event, it hadn't opened by then. In fact, writing to his great friend, the philosopher David Hume, he complained that he hadn't been introduced to the glittering intellectual society he'd been promised in Toulouse, and that he was thoroughly bored.
My dearest friend, the life which I led at Glasgow was a pleasurable, dissipated life, in comparison of that which I lead here at present. I've begun to write a book in order to pass away the time. You may believe I have very little to do.
The book that emerged from Smith's boredom was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, generally now known as The Wealth of Nations. It's the greatest book in economics ever written, and it's still a fascinating read. Smith talks about his conviction that trade is life-changing. It changes people, it changes whole societies. It changes them psychologically, it changes them politically, it changes them morally. And the fact that we trade with the outside world gives us a completely new perspective on everything. Now, how does that happen? It happens, according to Smith, because, in his words, the division of labour is limited by the extent of the market. In other words, the bigger the market with which you can trade, the better able you are to specialise in what you do best, and therefore to become even better at it. In some ways, trade gives you the chance to realise your potential. Adam Smith was writing at a time when British society was starting to change dramatically, and within a few decades it would have changed out of all recognition. Britain was specialising in the production of cotton textiles, which it was trading with the rest of the world for other goods, including wine from Portugal, which the 19th century economist David Ricardo used as an example of a process he called comparative advantage, in which each of a pair of trading partners specialise in what they relatively do best. By the 19th century, this process of specialisation had had dramatic consequences, not only for Britain, but for the rest of the world. Here's Richard Baldwin, Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva.
Trade happens when production and consumption are separated geographically, so stuff is made in one country and consumed in another. And although that has been going on since, well, basically forever, even Homo erectus seemed to have done some trade, it was done in such small quantities that it was kind of a curiosity to the economy. Or another way of saying it is that the economic conditions depended almost entirely on local supply and demand, almost nothing on international supply and demand, up until the early 19th century, when the ability to ship large amounts of goods over distance started to change that. So the way I think of it is, up until we got really good sailing ships and steamships and railroads, trade was the tail and the domestic economy was the dog. And the dog wagged the tail once in a while. It was an interesting story, but it wasn't the main event. After globalization really got started around, say, 1820, it was the tail wagging the dog. The point 1820 comes from research that was done by Oxford's Kevin O'Rourke and Harvard's Jeffrey Williamson.
When myself and Jeff Williamson argued that 19th century trade was different, we weren't saying that we had seen nothing to do with international trade in the past. We were arguing that it had qualitatively different effects on economies.
This is Kevin O'Rourke, Professor of Economic History at Oxford, whose work on grain prices with Jeffrey Williamson points to the early 19th century as a turning point for globalization.
19th century trade was different in nature because it involved very basic, bulky, cheap commodities being transported across the oceans of the world. It involved North American wheat being shipped into France or Britain, and thereby shaping the lives of ordinary peasants or tenant farmers or landlords. And that's something that we hadn't seen before, operating at that transcontinental level. You know, we had seen trade in wheat and other bulky commodities within Europe. We'd seen trade between continents in very precious spices, silver, Indian cotton textiles and so on. But that truly global trade in the most basic of all commodities, that was something new in the 19th century.
Seen from the perspective of today, all of this looks as though it was more or less inevitable. as though Western Europe and America were surely bound to emerge as the industrial powerhouse of the world. But let's look at it a bit differently. Suppose we turn the clock back 1,000 years and ask ourselves, what did it look like from the other side of the world? Here's Ian Morris, Professor of Classics at Stanford University, on the view from China at the start of the last millennium.
It can often be difficult for those of us based and educated in the West to realize just how different the planet looked when seen from China than it did when seen from Europe. 1,000 years ago, of course, the Chinese would simply never think about Europe. They knew of its existence, but it was so incredibly unimportant that no one gave it a moment's thought. And then gradually the Europeans start to get a bit more prominent in Chinese thinking as European markets for things like Chinese silks in particular start to grow. And initially, when Europeans start actually showing up on the coast of China in the 16th century, China is just not very interested in them at all. The Europeans are just like the Japanese and Koreans and all these other people who come to the coasts of China, because China is the economic centre of the world, and they want to do trade with China in order to enrich themselves. But on the whole, they don't seem to have anything the Chinese would particularly want.
So, as you say, the Chinese emperor is mildly curious about some of these Europeans who show up on the Chinese shores, but certainly not convinced that there's anything that Europe has to offer. There's an abrupt policy change when the Chinese emperor closes access to the oceans on pain of death. Can you tell us a bit about that episode?
Yeah, the Zheng He episode is one of the most interesting things, I think, in the whole global history of trade. And this is around about 1400, shortly after 1400, this story happens. And for several centuries, Chinese shipbuilding is just been getting better and better, and by 1400, they're building ships that could have sailed anywhere on the planet. They could certainly have circumnavigated the world before the Europeans did. Just incredible ships. And shortly after 1400, the Chinese emperor decides he's going to start sending gigantic fleets of these things out into the Indian Ocean. And they go to Mogadishu in East Africa. In the other direction, they quite probably go as far as the north coast of Australia. Fleets with tens of thousands of sailors on them, most spectacular demonstrations of power. And then they stop. In the 1430s, they just stop. And a lot of historians have looked at this and said, well, this shows something fundamentally wrong with the Chinese mentality. Just at the point in the 1430s when the Portuguese are beginning to explore the Atlantic, push down the west coast of Africa, the Chinese pull back. And this must express some kind of cultural weakness, some kind of fear of the wider world. And this is this turning point in history. And I think it's easy to misunderstand what's going on if you're a Westerner, because the world just looked so different for China in the 15th century. And these voyages had never really been about trade in the way that, say, a lot of the Portuguese and Spanish activity in the 16th century was. It was much more about the projection of soft power into the Indian Ocean to impress the local rulers that China is the greatest power on earth. But they're really, really expensive. A lot of people die, huge amounts of money get spent, and they get closed down because the emperor himself is about 10 years old. His people empanel a group of very highly qualified civil servants, the most learned people on earth probably, and they look into this and say, this is a stupid activity. China is the center of the global economy. Other traders are bringing everything we need to us at prices we can live with. The last thing we really want is lots of other people getting in on the Trade Act. We don't want our fleets opening up other markets willy-nilly. Sensible thing to do is shut this down. And then they finally decide, we're going to close this whole long-distance trade thing down completely. We're going to destroy all the records to prevent anyone else from trying to get in on it. And seen just from the short-term perspective of people in the Chinese government, this is not a stupid decision at all. But of course, what the Chinese don't know is that the Americas are there, and they don't know that ship development is going to continue to the point where in the 17th century the Europeans create this entirely new kind of economy around the shores of the North Atlantic that drives a European revolution, leads Europe to dominate the planet. There's absolutely no way that a Chinese official in the 15th century can foresee this. So it's one of these ironic, painful things that we do see quite a lot in history, where people make very sensible decisions for all the best reasons that turns out to be catastrophic.
Ian Morris. The unintended consequences of trade are going to be a recurring theme in this series, which brings us back to the Bibent Cafe here in Toulouse. Its golden splendor is a tribute to the self-confidence generated by nearly a century of growing prosperity, built on specialization and trade. But at the end of that century, in this very spot, just over 100 years ago, a group of anarchist conspirators called the Black Hand met to plot the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which plunged Europe into the First World War. By then, Britain had become so specialized in manufacturing that she had become dependent on importing food. That meant keeping naval control of the shipping lanes, and it was the importance of protecting the shipping lanes that in large part explains Britain's willingness to join the fighters on the continent of Europe. It proved to be one of the greatest shocks in the history of trade and in the history of the world. Here's Richard Baldwin again.
In some ways, I like this concept that they use in evolution of punctuated equilibria, where a particular path or set of forces has come into equilibrium, which tends to reproduce itself until there's a big shock, and then it jumps somewhere else and establishes a new equilibrium.
And this idea that the history of trade is punctuated by a series of shocks is one we'll explore later in the series. That shock can be disease. We'll look at how the Black Death was the result of trade, but changed the whole course of European civilization. The shock can be innovation. Think of the railway, the digital revolution, or the humble shipping container. And of course, the shock can be war. So trade can be stabilizing, but it can also be very disruptive. Adam Smith and his contemporaries were also convinced that it had a profound psychological impact on the individual people who engaged in it. The Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu wrote that peace is the natural effect of trade, and used the phrase doux commerce to describe the softening effect of trade on relations between people. But not everyone was sure they liked that. No less a person than the future President George Washington wrote to General James Warren in 1785,
"It has long been a speculative question among philosophers and wise men whether foreign commerce is of real advantage to any country. That is, whether the luxury, effeminacy, and corruption which are introduced by it are counterbalanced by the conveniences and wealth of which it is productive."
Did he really say that trade makes people effeminate? When we were doing the research for this series of programs, our first impressions were exactly the opposite. All those explorers, all those inventors, all those steamships and telegraphs and railway locomotives, all those boys with toys. Even the economists and historians writing about trade seem at first to be overwhelmingly male. In fact, as we'll see in episode 2, when we delve back into the prehistory of our species, it's the women who have the most fundamental lessons to teach us about why we trade.
Conflict and Cooperation was presented by Paul Seabright. The series is produced in Bristol by Chris Ledyard.
It's that time of year when your body probably consists of 1 part water and 510 parts alcohol, when the only exercise you've done of late is stretching for the remote control, and the only vaguely healthy thing you've eaten recently is an orange, a chocolate one. But fear not, BBC Radio 4 has plenty of advice on how this new year you can celebrate a new you. From how to react when in the vicinity of some kale, to how to save money by timing your arrival at a pub to avoid ever having to buy a round. Narrated by me, David Schneider, with charts, diagrams, and even some sound effects. No! Check out New Year, New You on the BBC Radio 4 website.
BBC News at 2 o'clock. State television in Iran says 10 people were killed overnight in anti-government protests across the country. At least 12 people are now known to have died since the protests began on Thursday. The demonstrations initially focused on economic grievances, but protesters are now calling for political change. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has claimed the entire United States is within range of his nuclear weapons.